I'm not going to reintroduce both of our next guests since they have both each debated once today. I am going to just simply say that this is only going to be a half an hour. We're not going to accept any questions. There will be a 7-minute opening statement from each of them, and then there will be cross-examination seated at the table again with Al moderating. So no questions for this section of the debate. This debate is, does Islam produce democracy? And to open with a 7-minute statement is Mustafa Akyol.
Thank you so much, Nick. Thank you so much. Podium there? Okay, good. Sure. Well, thank you so much. And I will speak about democracy, but I can't resist getting into the jihad issue, which was just discussed there, and I think because it's important. Few things. Yes, in Islamic tradition, there is the idea of a both defensive and an offensive jihad. Robert is right there. So jihad has not been interpreted only in the defensive sense. There has been an idea of offensive one. Where does it come from? If you ask me and people who think like me, I will tell you, Prophet Muhammad's wars were mainly defensive. He was initially persecuted, attacked. His community was tortured by the pagans of Mecca, and his whole military career is mainly a war with the Mecca pagans or those who allied with the pagans. So it was a war of survival. I would interpret his mission as a defensive military mission when it comes to the military mission. In that sense, he was not different from some of the Old Prophet Testaments, maybe. After Prophet Muhammad died, gradually the idea of an offensive jihad became more mainstream because of the political needs of the imperial urge of the time. It was an age of empires. Muslims created empires. Empires needed to expand. So that's the whole idea of abrogation, abrogating the peaceful verses with the more aggressive wars of the sword that there came to be. So yes, we have an idea of an aggressive jihad there, which says Islam will spread through conquests. People will not forced to accept Islam, but they have to pay taxes and accept the sovereignty of the Islamic State, and so on and so forth. That status was more preferable to some of the things in Catholic Europe, for example, at the time. That's why Jews fled to this Islamic world rather than being forced to conversion in Catholic Spain, for example. But we have to admit that there is this idea of an aggressive jihad, and of course it cannot have no exception in the modern world today. And I'm not the only person who says that. Many Islamic authorities have said that the idea of offensive jihad is actually something in history. It should not be valid in the modern world today. But I'll tell you one thing. Al-Qaeda and terrorists of the same kind, they are not actually referring to offensive jihad. They are, most of the time, referring to defensive jihad. They are arguing that the Muslim world is under attack. They're fighting back. They're retaliating. That's their rhetoric. This doesn't justify what they're doing, but that's their logic. So by just simply saying that, oh, there are terrorists who have referred to jihad, so this is offensive and they won't stop until destroying the Western civilization or subduing it, I think that's an exaggerated comment. And I'm not the only person who thinks like that. Various terrorism experts, I mentioned Robert Pape, there are other people in Washington, several think tanks would tell you, I can give you the sources, that they are mainly thinking that the Muslim world is under attack, whereas in the West, it's thought that the West is under attack. I think both sides in this whole thing think that this side is the victim and under attack, and that's how the logic works in their mind. However, there is one thing very crucial that I didn't hear Robert Spencer discuss. In classical jihad doctrine, there are rules of waging jihad. There are certain limitations on using military means. There is a big concern about combatants and non-combatants. In no classical Islamic texts, it is said that Muslims can go and attack innocent civilians. There has always been a distinction between combatants and non-combatants. And what Al-Qaeda does today, which is unacceptable from any traditional Islamic source, is that they think civilians are a legitimate target as well. And I'm not the only person who says this. For example, Bernard Lewis, a great scholar of Islam, who's sometimes even considered a critic of Islam, said in one of his books, which I quoted in my book, he notes that fighters in jihad are enjoined not to kill women, children, the aged, unless they attack first, nor to torture, mutilate prisoners, to give fair warning of the resumption of hostilities, so on and so forth.
I need to tell you, we got about 2 minutes, and you haven't
Okay.
gone to the democracy thing yet, and I thought that was very good and interesting, but I just want you to know that 2 minutes and you're toast.
Perfect. Perfect. I gave 5 minutes to jihad and 2 minutes to democracy right now. Does Islam produce democracies? Well, not really. But the question is it an obstacle to democracy? And I would say no, if it is understood in a certain way. I come from Turkey, who has a parliamentary history since 1876. In 1876, the first Islamically blessed parliament on earth was opened by the blessing of the Sultan Caliph, some of whose members were non-Muslims, because non-Muslims of the Ottoman Empire were given equal citizenship, and later women acquired the same rights in the Ottoman Empire, and how the Ottomans actually realized that reform, which allowed the multi-party democracy in the Ottoman Empire, is a very interesting story, forgotten by some Muslims and many non-Muslims as well. And today in the Middle East, if you look at Islamic thinkers like Rashid Ghannouchi in Tunisia, he will tell you that democracy is the system that Muslims should accept. He would defend that women should have the same rights. He would tell you that apostasy is not a crime. Islam is based on freedom. So there are Islamic thinkers who advocate for democracy. There are Islamic thinkers who are against democracy. One of them is Maududi, which Robert Spencer quoted as one of the most prominent theologians of the 20th century. He's actually the founder of Islamism, the very ideology that I criticize, Maududi and Qutb. These were the people who didn't defend democracy. One thing interesting, Maududi, that Robert Spencer quoted, he was inspired by traditional Islam, but also by European fascism. In the 30s, he said, fascism is actually a good idea, an all-encompassing state. But the idea that the state imposes should be Islam, so it would be a good model. He synthesized Islam with fascism. I would synthesize it with liberal democracy. And I think it's not as it's not a hopeless case as some people would think it is. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mustafa. 7 minutes, Robert.
Okay, I guess I have to do a few on jihad first. Before I was rudely and repeatedly interrupted earlier, I was trying to explain that distinction about defensive and offensive jihad. Because in Sunni Muslim theology, the caliph is the successor of Muhammad as the political, military, and spiritual leader of the Muslim community. And he only has the authorization to declare offensive jihad. Offensive jihad cannot exist without his authorization, not lawfully. There has been no caliph because the secular Turkish government abolished the caliphate in 1924. There has been no caliph for almost 90 years now. And that is the chief grievance of the Islamic Sharia groups and the Islamic jihad groups who want to restore the caliphate, like the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and the others who've taken power in the so-called Arab Spring over the last few years. They want to restore the caliphate so that they can wage offensive jihad. But in the meantime, all jihads are defensive, and that's why they retail these endless lists of grievances. That's how they justify their jihads. If without those grievances, their jihads are not justified because there is no authorization to wage offensive jihad today. Mr. Akyol has thus proven my point in the earlier debate. Mr. Lewis would not concede that there was offensive jihad at all. Mr. Akyol has readily conceded it. I thank you for telling the truth about that. In the meantime, offensive jihad, he did say, is something that developed in medieval times after Muhammad. Actually, it originates in the Quran in chapter 9 and with Muhammad's offensive expedition to Tabuk, which I discussed earlier. And as far as Muslims not being able to attack innocent civilians, there again, that revolves around the controversy about whether any non-Muslims can be innocent, which is a controversy that is discussed among Islamic scholars. And Muhammad goes on both sides of the issue, as is often the case in the Hadith. In some Hadith, he says that you cannot attack women and children. And if your attack will kill women and children, you can't pursue it. But in another, they come to him and they say, we're besieging this fortress, but there are women and children of the pagans in there. And he says, oh, they are of them. In other words, they're all pagans. They can all be killed. And so both sides can quote either one to justify their positions, and unfortunately then the Muslims who justify the killings of innocent civilians can and do justify their positions on the basis of Islamic teachings that go to the Quran, go as far back as the Quran and Muhammad. Now, does Islam produce democracy? Well, it never has. Not in 1,400 years of Islam in the world have we seen an Islamic democracy. And you can say, oh, but what about Mr. Akyol's own homeland of Turkey, which is my homeland as well? And what about the democracy there? Well, as a matter of fact, at the fall of the Ottoman Empire, the secular Turkish state was founded by a man named Kemal Ataturk, who is now widely vilified in the Islamic world as a great enemy of Islam. And why was he a great enemy of Islam? Because he established a secular state, and he did so explicitly, openly, and avowedly in the context of fighting against political Islam, and in acting to restrict the political and supremacist aspects of Islam that made a pluralistic and secular republic impossible. He forbade the turban and made Muslims wear the brim hats, fedoras, that men used to wear in the West until Kennedy. And that was because when they made the prostrations for prayers, they didn't take their hats off inside, I guess. They would hit their heads on the brim and not be able to pray. He was actively working against prayer. He forbade the Arabic characters for the Turkish language, and Turkish is written in the Roman characters ever since then. He specifically forbade the imams in the mosques to preach sermons of their own devising. You couldn't, if you're the local imam, write a sermon and preach it on the Friday noon prayers, because he didn't want political Islam to be preached out of the Quran, where it manifestly is. So the Ministry of Religion in Ankara would send a sermon every week to all the mosques, and they would have to preach that. And this was specifically to restrict political Islam. So in other words, Turkey has been, up until the advent of this latest government, which is steadily dismantling Turkish secularism, Turkey has been a secular state since the 1920s, but only because Islam has been restricted. So the question of, does Islam produce democracy? If we look at the sole candidate that the case could possibly be made upon, Turkey, then it falters. Everywhere else, there have been authoritarian states ruled by authoritarian rulers who modeled themselves after the authoritarian ruler par excellence, who was Muhammad, who became a political leader when he moved the Muslims from Mecca to Medina in the 12th year of his career as a prophet and began waging war against the unbelievers around him. He did not brook any kind of discussion or disagreement. He did not allow non-Muslims to have equality of rights with the Muslims. And he, as the excellent example of conduct, as the Quran calls him in chapter 33, verse 21, his behavior is normative. This is why authoritarian states that do not accord equality of rights to women or equality of rights to non-Muslims, and do not have any kind of representative government except perhaps in a limited way, such as Mr. Akyol alluded to in Turkey in the late 19th century under Western pressure, that they allow Muslim males to have some sort of a representative assembly. There has been authoritarian state after authoritarian state. And ultimately, this goes back to theological questions and to the fact that Allah himself is presented in the Quran as essentially an authoritarian ruler of his own, who is an absolute unity, is not in a community of love such as the Holy Trinity, but is an absolute unity and an absolute dictator who is not to be questioned, as I quoted chapter 5, verse 101 earlier, that you're not to question things that might cause you trouble, and many people have lost their faith as a result of doing so. And so this does not, when you're discouraged from questioning, this does not create an atmosphere in which a democracy can arise, because democracy is precisely about the people ruling and having a say, rather than an authoritarian ruler ruling in the name of an authoritarian God having the sole say. And so, does Islam produce democracy? It never has, and unless it is drastically reconstituted, unless Mustafa Akyol becomes the caliph of the Muslims and reorients Islam altogether, it never will.
Thank you, Robert. We're going to have 15 minutes for cross-examination and questions for Mal.
Question, 1 minute. Answer, 2 minutes. That's why moderators exist. All right, why don't you lead off?
Thank you. Robert, I disagree with, first of all, the Tabuk expedition. In my understanding, it was perceived from the Muslim side that the Byzantines are going to attack them, so they went on as a precaution, but no battle happened because the Byzantines were not there when they went there. So we have different interpretations probably about that, but that's also what I'm saying in the Islamic tradition. Well, as you said, well, there has never been really democracy that much in the Middle East, and you tied it to Islam and its understanding of God. I wonder why Russia, a predominantly Christian nation, has never been very democratic either. You know, the Tsar, the Soviet Union, and now the authoritarian rule of Putin. Is this a product of Christianity in Russia, or is this a product of other factors, certain political culture that happens to be strong in that part of the world? I choose the latter. It is true that there are no liberal democracies in the Middle East today. There are some efforts to create democracies in Iraq, in post-war Iraq, in Tunisia, in Egypt. These countries are challenging.
Okay. Go ahead, Robert.
They were at Tabuk, they were going to attack, and yet when the Muslims got there, they weren't there. It's a strange way to pursue a military attack, to leave when the people you want to attack show up. And so it's clear, what we're talking about is this expedition to Tabuk, Muhammad's last military expedition. The claim by both Mr. Lewis and Mr. Akil is that the Byzantines were going to attack the Muslims, and so Muhammad went up to meet them. But when he got there, they weren't there. And yet, they never did attack at any other time. The Byzantines did not engage the Muslims in any offensive attack at any time. The Muslims attacked them when they stormed out of Arabia in the 630s, and they began besieging and conquering vast expanses of the Byzantine Empire, and ultimately besieged Constantinople in the year 711 for the first time. They were going to attack, and yet they weren't there. It doesn't add up. As far as Russia goes, I wouldn't say that Russia is authoritarian and always has been because of Christianity, because there are other Christian states that have long and hardy democratic traditions, where there is no Islamic state that has any democratic tradition anywhere. And so the comparison is kind of apples and oranges. There are a variety of reasons why Russia might be authoritarian. Christianity is not likely to be one of them, since it doesn't always and in every case produce authoritarian states. Islam always has in every case.
Okay. 1 minute question, 2 minute response. Robert has the question.
Here again, as I started the last debate, the question would be, if Islam produces democracy, how come so many Muslims misunderstand it? Why is it that there has been no democracy in 1,400 years in numerous states across the globe, and numerous Islamic scholars who could have talked about democracy and pluralism and become the John Locke and the Thomas Jefferson of Islam? Why aren't there any? Why haven't there been any?
Well, there are actually thinkers that have said, that have had ideas similar to John Locke, and I refer to them in my book, in the medieval Islamic era. But you're asking me not a religious question, you're asking me a political science question. Why did not Christianity produce any democracy until the 15th, 16th century? And why there have been 1,000-year long of democracy-free medieval world? Was it Christianity by itself as the explanation? Was it social, political factors in Europe at the time? So the fact that Islamic world doesn't have democracy doesn't mean that the Middle East is solely shaped by Islam. It is shaped by a lot of dynamics that has shaped Russia or China or any other country in the East as well. The West admittedly created liberal democracy after a lot of challenges. And Christianity is not the only reason why this success happened in the West. There are many other factors. When Christians, for example, looked in the modern era to New Testament, they said, it says render unto God what is God's and to Caesar what is Caesar's. Medieval Christians didn't get the idea of a separation of church and state from that verse. Modern Christians started to get. My argument is that there are roots of even separation of church and state in the Quran, in the Islamic tradition. But Muslims will start to look at that from a certain perspective when Muslim societies get more modernized, educated, economically prosperous, and politically more stable. And this is a social, political work improvement. It's not going to happen simply by changes of theology. And if you ask me where are the John Locke's of Islam, there are people out there. If you want to meet them, I can introduce you. Their ideas are in my book.
Robert, do you want to follow up? He asked a question in the middle of that, which could serve as his next question, which is, what took Christianity so long to produce the democracies that we now identify as democracies?
Well, I think that democracy itself is, aside from Athens, a relatively new idea in the evolution of human thought, and that it evolved because of various principles that were present within Christianity and made it possible for it to evolve, about the dignity, the universal dignity of the human person, and various other teachings which are unfortunately not present within Islam. So the follow-up would be, for example, the Quran says in chapter 48, verse 29, Muhammad is the apostle of Allah. Those who follow him are merciful to one another, but harsh to the unbelievers. And so if a Muslim who follows Allah is supposed to be merciful to the Muslims, but harsh to the unbelievers, it's hard to see how that could ever develop into a representative assembly in which the unbelievers have a part to play with equal dignity to the Muslims. And so wouldn't that be, aren't the impediments right at the core of the religion?
Well, it depends what you look at in the Quran and how to interpret it. Let me read another verse from the Quran, which is for me the foundation of a pluralistic open society. It says, "We have sent down the book, the Quran, to you, to Muhammad, with truth, confirming and conserving the previous books, which is the Bible. We have appointed a law and a practice for every one of you. Had God willed, he would have made you a single community, but he wanted to test you regarding what has come to you. So compete with each other in doing good. Every one of you will return to God, and he will inform you regarding the things about which you differed." Now, this is a verse from the Quran, which tells that God created different communities, and he wants them to compete in doing good, and he will inform them about their differences in afterlife. Murjiites, an Islamic sect in early Islam, by referring to this verse and another verse, they basically said the differences among Muslims, among different communities, religious communities as well, will be settled in afterlife. So let's postpone all our disputes to afterlife to be resolved by God and live in pluralism. That's why they were called postponers. And it was John Locke who made the very same argument in his letter concerning toleration, which he wrote in the 17th century. So there are roots for pluralism in the Quran if you look for them. And when you show me verses in the Quran about Prophet Muhammad's wars with pagans, I would explain to you as contextual events, and these verses in the Quran about pluralism as the ideal purpose of Islam that will be valid forever, regardless of content.
Let me ask if, aren't you out, I mean, you're pretty far out on a limb though, aren't you?
I'm pretty far
Arguing
in
this
there?
way? Yeah. No, I'm serious. I mean, you've got, Turkey is about as close as you get to a democratic, polity among Muslim-dominated societies. And I think the question is, it isn't as though democracy is arising for the first time in human history. In other words, we've had models of democracy that the various Muslim people could see, and yet there's still tremendous resistance to it. Now, what you're proposing, I think strikes many people as good, obviously goodwill, but how likely is it that with the example of Western democracy that we've had for a few centuries now, how likely is it that the Muslim-dominated nations who often complain about the history of colonialism and all this, which Turkey didn't have, how likely is it they're going to buy the argument from democracy? It's been out there for a few hundred years now.
Well, it's been out there for a few hundred years, and several Muslim nations have been aspiring to it. One of them is Turkey. Robert Spencer showed Ataturk as the biggest, best thing that has ever happened to Turkey. I disagree. Actually, Turkey was more democratic before Ataturk. We had a multi-party system in late Ottoman Empire and the War of Liberation era. And Turkey became more democratic after Ataturk because he was secular, but an authoritarian secular leader. Actually, one of the misfortunes of the Middle East is that separation of church and state, a very great idea, an American idea. We didn't know that. We had authoritarian secularism, which came with the zeal of persecuting religion. The Kemalist revolution in Turkey, it didn't bring freedom. It only brought freedom from religion by oppressing religious communities, including Christians as well, not just Muslims. In the Arab world, in Tunisia, secularism came from France, from the Third Jacobin Republic of France, which was all about oppressing religion. And that created a reaction to Western models. Because the Western models we got were never democratic, it was authoritarian. Now, in Turkey, we have a functioning democracy. We still have problems with regards to freedom of speech and so on and so forth. But it is not the obstacle to democracy in Turkey is really not Islam. It is more so nationalism, which really has a intolerant attitude towards minorities. When it comes to the Middle East, when you look at Tunisia, when you look at Egypt, these countries are struggling for democracy. They have first free and fair elections, and they have a military coup. Then they want another free and fair elections. And the obstacles are sometimes coming from authoritarianism by the Islamists. It is sometimes coming from authoritarianism of the secularists. That's my argument. We have a problem with authoritarianism in the Middle East, but it is a root problem that is rooted in political structures and not necessarily coming from Islam. Islam sometimes comes for a battle cry for freedom.
Robert, why don't you go ahead and take the last word on this?
When Mr. Akil mentioned the postponers, the people who said, whatever our various sectarian or creedal differences, we'll postpone them until the next world, and we'll live in harmony in this world. The question arises, it kind of reminds me of those lists of things that Muslims invented, you know, algebra and alchemy and all sorts of things that start with al. And the thing that arises, the question that nobody ever asks about these lists of Muslim inventions is, why didn't they do anything with them? If the postponers had the idea of a pluralistic society, how come none arose? If some Muslim, I forget his name, realized before Copernicus that the Earth went around the sun, why didn't he make any astronomical discoveries the way Copernicus and his followers did? How come it was always the West that made these breakthroughs? It was because of certain inherent impediments that I outlined before, the denial of the universal dignity of the human person and so on, that militated against democracy. I also have to say about Kemal Ataturk, he said that I said he was the greatest thing that ever happened to Turkey. I certainly do not think that. Ataturk was responsible for the Armenian genocide that killed 1.5 million people. To a tremendous degree, he was responsible, I should say. And he also was responsible for the exile of my own grandparents from that area, they were invited to accept Islam, refused to accept Islam, and were exiled. Many, many millions of people suffered the same fate. Even though Ataturk was a secularist, he thought that a secular, depoliticized Islam was an essential element of the Turkish identity. And so he allowed Muslim clerics to persecute, and they did viciously, the non-Muslims there. And so it wasn't just nationalism that was responsible for these atrocities. It was unfortunately done with the willing participation of the Muslim clerics of Turkey. And so the difficulty is within Islam itself in terms of rejecting the dignity of those non-Muslim people, rejecting their right to live as equals with Muslims in a pluralistic society on an indefinite basis. Unless and until those elements of Islam are decisively rejected by the leading authorities in the Islamic world, then I wish Mustafa Akil well. I just hope he doesn't suffer the fate of the Moroccan cleric who recently said that it was terrible that violence should be perpetrated in the name of Islam and that they have to work against that, whereupon he was declared an apostate and a heretic by his fellow Muslim clerics in Morocco and is now living under the threat of death. This makes it difficult for reform to happen and makes it very unlikely that Islam will ever produce democracy. Thank you.
What I'm going to do at this point is issue one last question, which goes directly to this morning's opening, having to do with the big difference. Seems to me there are two ways of going at this. One is deal with the nature of God. The other one is deal with the nature of man. Since we're talking about political order and civic order here, I think I'll limit this question to the nature of man. Biblically, we're told that human beings are made in the image and likeness of God. And it's generally thought that the Western world has developed its free institutions in part because of that understanding of the human person and that respect for human choice and the significance of human action. What is the best one can say of the human person looking at the authoritative sources of Islam? Begin with you on that, Akul.
One tiny note for Robert. Ataturk was not actually involved in the Armenian massacres, but during the Armenian massacres, if you want to call it genocide, there were Islamic clerics who opposed the secular government's decision to expel the Armenians because they said the Armenians have Islamic right to survive, and maybe it would be interesting for you to look at that. As for the human being, well, the Quran doesn't define human beings as created in the image of God. The Quran defines human beings as God's viceroys. So we have, and also says God gave a part of his soul to humanity, to Adam. So we carry God's essence according to Islam. Human beings are noble because they have this divine spark in them. And human beings are also very different from anything else because they have the responsibility to choose. They have the freedom to choose. That's why humans are elevated above all other creatures. But if they are unbelievers and sinners, then they are the worst. In that whole idea that humans are valuable because they're God's creations is deeply rooted in Islam. According to Sufi teachings, Muslims are supposed to love the created for the sake of the creator. Well, that's not what you hear from Osama bin Laden, unfortunately. People like him, but that is also an Islamic teaching. Unfortunately, in this particular junction in history, the political tension between East and West only shows us the tensions between Islam and Christianity. But actually, there's a lot of commonality, and there's a lot of history of cooperation, understanding between Islam and Christianity. And when I listen to Christian sermons, when I listen to Thanksgiving, today Robert said Islam doesn't have thankfulness. I don't know where you get that. Every day I thank God for creating me, giving my food, giving my bread, giving my wife, giving my life and everything. The whole idea that you should pray 5 times a day is to give thanks to God for all what he has given for you. And I think that whole idea of man as a dignified being, because he's created and elevated by God, is at the core of Islam. And from that on, actually, I have a vision of an Islamically inspired democracy, a liberal democracy, in which man's freedom will be at the core. And yes, this is not a very popular idea right now. John Locke was not very popular in the 16th century. I'm not saying that the Muslim world today is wonderful. I'm talking about what it can be, and we will see.
Do the authoritative sources of Islam have that kind of elevated view of the human person that Mustafa laid out for us? How do you read it?
No. Chapter 3, verse 110 of the Quran says that the Muslims are the best of people, the best nation on earth. Contrast that to chapter 98, verse 6 of the Quran, which says that the unbelievers from among the people of the book, that is, the Jews and Christians who don't accept Islam and don't become Muslims, are the most vile of created beings. So you have, on the one hand, the best of people and the most vile of created beings. It is difficult to envision any kind of universality of human dignity on that basis. I also have to say, just as a corrective, I never said Islam doesn't create thankfulness. That's pure fabrication. And
I
Islamic
think he
clerics
took that from me, by
who,
the way.
well, he said Robert. And Islamic clerics who opposed
Sorry, it wasn't
expelling
you,
the
it was the first
Armenians
speaker.
were in the minority. Most Islamic clerics favored expelling the Armenians because they were classified as kafir harbi, infidels at war with Islam, because they had been subject people, they had been zimmis, and then they rebelled and they wanted their independence, and so they had to be killed. And this went for the Greeks as well.
We will leave it there. Thank you both very much.
Rizal.